Grid Kids.
Hey everybody, welcome to the 10th episode of the Grid Kids podcast. I'm your host, Nicholas Semrad, and real quick, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Spectrasonics. These guys are the creators of some absolutely incredible music-making software such as Trillion, Omnisphere, Keyscape, and Stylus RMX. As I've mentioned before, I was never really a fan of much music software before because I always found it kind of clunky and hard to use, and honestly, it never really sounded that good to me. Well, Eric Persing and the cats over at Spectrasonics have changed all that for me. Their programs are incredibly easy to use, they sound exactly the same as the pieces of hardware that they're trying to emulate, and are doing some really groundbreaking new stuff where they're able to map completely to a bunch of the most common hardware pieces we use, such as Yamaha, Nord, Korg, Moog, Sequential boards, you name it, they've created a hardware profile for it. It's unbelievable, and it makes making music way easier for me. So head on over to their website at spectrasonics.net and check it out. As for this 10th episode, it's not every day that I get to interview someone who has done for music what this guy has done. He basically invented MIDI and polyphonic synthesis, and in a bunch of ways, a lot of the things we do with keyboards wouldn't exist without him and his company. The keyboards that they've created are the basis of sounds on thousands of legendary recordings, from Pink Floyd's The Wall to hits by the Cars. These boards and the sounds that come out of them have been an absolutely vital part of my career for the past 10 years or so, and honestly, I've been waiting for this interview since I started this podcast. Our guests for this episode are the absolutely legendary inventor, creator, and engineer, Mr. Dave Smith, and his right-hand man over at Sequential, Mr. Andrew McGowan. I am sitting here with the legendary cats, Mr. Dave Smith and Mr. Andrew McGowan. I would say welcome, but I'm in your shop. So thank you for allowing me to be here, invade the bay yet again, and see
Always
all your,
happy to have you here.
See
Definitely.
all your hidden secrets.
Ah,
Every time I'm in here,
Don't tell.
I'm not going to say a word, but every time I'm in here, I leave wanting to be poorer, which I think is what you want. I think
That makes us happy.
our
Yeah.
evil
Not you
plan.
being poor, but
So I'm sure most of my listeners know who y'all are, but let's run through the list of the Dave Smith accomplishments very quickly, just to let the youngsters know. You were the designer / inventor of the Prophet 5. You pretty much invented MIDI and did the world's first software-based PC synth, vector synthesis, wave sequencing. You have more Grammys than I do, which is awesome. And and yeah, you're definitely in the I think Mount Rushmore was only 4 heads, but if there was a synth Mount Rushmore, I feel like you're there. So
Wow, thanks.
yeah, and I feel like I owe you royalties for both of you, actually, for as much as I play your things.
oh well, that works both ways. You're highly visible,
Exactly.
so we're happy about that.
I love it. It's been cool. My first synth was a Prophet 8, and I literally turned it on, pressed a note, and nothing happened. And I knew then that I was in for a shitstorm.
Educational process.
It was really great, but it literally took me about a month of saying I'm not gonna gig on this thing for a minute, am I? And it took me a month, but I at least got comfy enough to start bringing it out. And now I'm in trouble because now everything you guys put out, I have to own because they're so fucking cool.
Hopefully the reward was great enough to warrant the work you put in.
It definitely was, and I was planning on ending with this question, but I'm tempted to start with it. I've been to dinner with both of you a few times now, and I've noticed that you have an extremely keen ear for knowing where your synths are used. And I'm curious as to, maybe I don't want to ask a top 5, but maybe a super notable 2 or 3 tunes that you know of that your instrument has, that you're happy about.
Wow, that's always a hard one.
Yeah, what era are we talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah. Let's go just classics. Let's say pre 1990. I'm going to piss off all the indie rock bands from up here and say...
Everything in its right place. Radiohead.
Okay.
Prophet 5. Well, all the Prophet 5 stuff. I mean, there's...
Like all the car shit was
cars,
all...
yeah. Meow, meow, meow. Yeah, that one.
Japan's Tin Drum album for me is kind of the ultimate Prophet 5 record.
Okay.
The Wall. Pink Floyd.
That
I
was
mean,
Prophet 5,
that sold a few.
5.
That was all Prophet 5. We have a photo. Somebody just found it recently of the Prophet 5 that was used back then, and it has tape across the wood, and you can just barely read it, and it has all the tunes from The Wall.
Yeah.
And which patch he used on it.
Fuck. Awesome.
I'll show it to you later.
Oh my God, that's amazing. I'm trying to think, what was the, was Prince diving into the Prophet business?
VS maybe?
I mostly think of him as an Oberheim guy. He did have a Prophet VS, and I think I've heard that he had a Pro 1 as well.
Okay.
We don't always know everybody that uses our stuff and which instruments and which songs. So, there was Genesis, Peter Gabriel, Phil Collins. That was all Prophet 5 stuff.
In the Air Tonight.
Yeah.
Oh, geez. Yeah. That's a fairly decent library already of things to be proud of.
Yeah.
And we could go on.
Of course. Yeah. I'm mainly curious, like, obviously you started this whole process as it's seemingly a hobbyist right away, and then you started selling them. And then I guess I'm kind of curious about, like, when you started selling these things, like, what were your expectations of what you were going to hear, or like, what did you want to hear? Like, did you want to hear people use these things as like, just, like really experimental and weird, or did you want to like see people use it melodically and like make really tasty things? Did you have any kind of preconceptions? Like,
initially my first products were not anything that made sound. I made a couple sequencers, and I made a synth programmer, and so the Prophet 5 was the first actual musical instrument.
Okay.
And
although the sequencer could be used as an oscillator.
That's true. The very first one could, as a random waveform generator.
Killing. Okay.
It was voltage controlled. Yeah. You run the sequencer real fast and it becomes, a wave shape. I forgot about that. But no, when you're designing something like the Prophet 5, I didn't have there was no targets. It wasn't like this is going to be awesome for jazz or rock or soundtracks. And this is back in the days when people still thought that synthesizers were stealing jobs from musicians. We actually had to deal with that to a small degree. I mean, it wasn't a big deal, but that was a lot of the, musicians union and this and that. But no, there wasn't a target. That's the great thing about synths is even now it's all kinds of music. We even now don't ever design an instrument with anything specific in mind musically. It's just we want something that sounds cool, it's fun to play.
It probably makes it exciting too, like to hear all the ways it's used then, because you don't have one path.
That's always the payoff for all of us is watching what people do with them. It's just like, we didn't think of that. That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely that's the reward. Yeah. Because as much as I love synths, I actually spend very little time playing them because I'm busy designing and doing other stuff.
Yeah.
So hearing somebody use them and how they use them is great. It's really exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, we get that in the development process, like in our new product that not mentioned.
Yep.
Somebody will be testing.
Really cool, though.
Somebody will be testing something, and all of a sudden they'll start making a sound, and all of a sudden, everybody else in the office is going, "Whoa, that sounds really, really good. What are you doing?"
Yeah.
And so we have that discovery like nonstop during process of development, and then it just kicks up to another level when musicians start using it for real.
Yeah.
So,
and it doesn't get old. I mean, as long as you've been doing this, it's still exciting that first time you hear it and go, "Oh, that's cool."
Well, it's probably interesting. Like, I mean, even the experience I had doing like the Rev 2 stuff or whatever, it's like getting the model and hearing what had already been done on it. I was like, oh shit, like I wouldn't have even thought to do that boat, and I'm sure like every design, it's like adding another layer every time someone got it. They were like, oh man, now there's all that stuff and all that stuff. And it's definitely, my experience with these boards has been interesting because everybody I meet who has one comes from a different angle. It's not like there's 2 or 3 schools of like, oh yeah, this person's like stock designer A or like lead designer B or whatever. It's like literally everyone has, like, even people who I wouldn't consider synthesists, I'll hang with them and I'll learn something that I haven't heard before. So it's
yeah, whether it's fair or not, I think we're often kind of in people's minds, we're thought of as like the polysynth guys.
Yeah.
And I think just by virtue of that, we tend to have a lot more keyboard players as customers, maybe than some other synth companies do.
Yeah. I could see that. So before I dive into the next question, you worked for Sequential starting when? It's been you, Andrew. Sorry,
It's been 40 years.
This month.
This month.
That's amazing.
So I was 20 years old.
Okay.
Started at Sequential. And people often sort of jump to the conclusion that because I've worked with Dave on and off, mostly on for 40 years, that I was like his right-hand man and sort of, a key player.
Yeah.
I was not.
Okay.
Not then.
I started as an electromechanical assembler and had no. I was very interested in synthesizers. I mean, that was my main reason for wanting to work there. But I didn't even know how to solder at that point, much less have any sort of electronics background.
Sure. Yeah. And the Prophet 5 came out in 78, right?
Yeah.
Was the first.
Yes.
So I was working on Rev 2 Prophet 5s when I started.
Killing. Okay. I'm curious, like, it seems like nowadays in keyboard land, and I work for enough to see a little bit of the like testing process, and I have a little bit of an insider view, but it seems like now, like, there's new versions of technology, but there's not really new technologies, like company A, company B will all just kind of battle to see whose samples sound better and what action sounds better. I'm curious as to, like, because you were literally like the first polyphonic synth, did you ever feel like this, like a stress regarding keeping that secret until it was out?
No, because everything was tiny back then. There was no synth industry. There was, and I was, Sequential at the time only had a few people in it.
Yeah.
So there was no exposure to anybody who would find out about it.
There was no like deep synth market that could have been like, oh shit, let's take that.
No.
Because I feel like if you did that now, like if you came up with a new technology now that was as killing as that was at the time, like you would be headhunted. Like, I mean, people would be trying to sneak into your office and figure it out.
Well, and we do new things.
Yeah.
There are technology advances and breakthroughs, but they aren't always obvious.
Sure.
The Prophet 6 was a fairly major step forward for us.
Okay.
But from the outside, you'd never know that.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, this is just kind of an updating of a Prophet 5.
Was there a moment in particular where you kind of realized that you had created a train?
Which one? The Prophet 6?
Well, I think even older, like with the Prophet 5 stuff, like was there a specific moment where you're like, oh fuck, this thing is huge?
Oh, yeah, pretty much within the first week. I mean, we showed it at the 1978 NAMM show in January that was in the basement of the Disneyland Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we knew immediately. It was a tiny show, but we were approached by Moog and ARP, and everybody who saw it was just blown away. And 3 or 4 months later, when we first started shipping them, the first 10 went to Joe Zawinul, Rick Wakeman, David Bowie. And I remember getting a phone call from Rick Wakeman when he first saw it. And this is back when, people didn't know it was call overseas.
Yeah. And
he was just like, this thing is magic. I think it was actually the word he used. So no, we knew from the beginning. And our biggest problem the first couple of years was we couldn't build them.
Yeah.
fast enough because we were a tiny bootstrap company with no money, and there are all kinds of technical problems because the design was, quite frankly, not particularly reliable or roadworthy.
Yeah.
And everybody wanted one, and everybody had certainly the first few units were love-hate relationships because they loved the unit, but it would sometimes break more than it should have. And so it was a turbulent time.
And how was the relationship with, you were saying that like the other synth cats were coming up and noticing this thing, like was the perception of y'all, like, I mean, obviously it's positive in terms of they I'm assuming they were excited about it, but like,
yes.
Did you receive any sort of like pushback business wise to where like you knew that you were kind of tapping into a market that could interfere with these people's success? Like, did you get any of that?
Not directly.
Yeah.
Like I said, back then, the musician union was all up in arms about synthesizers putting real musicians out of work, even though it takes a musician to play a synth. But, that was kind of a sidelight. Again, our biggest problem was we just couldn't get them to people. And people were constantly calling and say, do you know who I am? Where's my Prophet 5? I ordered it,
And how does that work back? I mean, how did that work back then regarding, now you have like the waiting list and everything's easily organized. Like, how were you keeping track of all that back then? Or were you just kind of like...
We were actually very fair about it. You put an order in and you got in line, and I don't remember usually moving people up because they were more important. We tried to be really fair about it. And a certain amount of people got pretty upset about that. And, it literally was, do you know who I am? And, it's annoying, but
I could see that. What was your, I'm curious as to what the Bob Moog interactions were. Because I've heard so many stories of him, but how was, you said his reception was warm, like.
Well, when I said Moog approached us, it wasn't Bob. It was people in his company. And, Moog's company kind of, go out of business, restart, go out of business, restart. Sure. And, it was doing okay then, I think. And I forget when I first met Bob, but it was probably around 78 or 79. And back then, we were all friends with each other in the industry, even though we were, vicious competitors, there was always a camaraderie. Sure. We'd all go to a NAMM show and go have drinks or do whatever over the years. So, the personal side was much different than the business side.
When it seems like, even today to a certain extent, it's like certain markets are that and certain markets are the opposite of that. And there's no middle, like I see y'all's relationship with Tom Oberheim, and like obviously that seems like it's in good shape, and like you did a bunch of stuff with Roger Lynn, right?
The Tempest was
and all these guys, like and I see that correlating over to like pedal world a little bit, where I see companies like Earthquaker and Red Panda like sharing pedals because it's like you're excited, that your thing is killing, and then there's something else that's killing, and you're like just hyped to like, we're both moving forward. And there's so many of the bigger cats who seem like it's like there's a zero-sum game happening, and like, so it's exciting to see this world kind of not be that. I'm sure there's pieces of it that
there are exceptions to that rule.
But it's just really cool to have kind of that camaraderie of like, hey, you guys like my stuff, like let's work together on something, and like you don't see that in a lot of industries now. So
well, and I think Dave and I both, a big part of the reason that we got into synthesizers and the synthesizers that first interested us were Moog instruments. It's not, you can't deny that. It's oh no, it just like out of the blue decided to.
Was your first board a mini Moog as well?
My first synthesizer was a micro Moog that my parents rented for me for my high school graduation.
Wow! Wait, for like a party, they just rented a micro Moog?
No, it was like by the month. It was kind of was a rent to own,
like music stores
deal.
used to do. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and I had
rent to own.
I didn't actually ever own it. I had it for maybe 6 months or something like that. But.
Yeah, And my first, as you know, is the Mini Moog that's actually right behind you.
Killing.
It is a number
beauty.
340. I bought it in 1972.
Holy shit.
And somehow it's still here. I can't believe it. It's disappeared for like 5 years at a time. And then, this is, it's.
But it disappeared under your, like you lose it or what?
Well, no, somebody borrows it and I forgot it. But I mean, again, you're talking.
Under a workbench. It's Sequential for how long?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost 50 years old if you think about it. So, shit happens during that time.
It was it was the test fixture for the Model 800 sequencers at
that's right.
at Sequential, and that was the only thing I think it ever got used for.
That's so good. You had mentioned something that Dave, you had. One of the reasons you prefer hardware over software, I mean, obviously you have your software experience and did very well in that field, but something that you prefer about hardware is that you can build something, it exists, and then you can kind of leave it and move on to other things, and it'll just exist forever. You don't have to update it. You don't have to like deal with operating systems and platforms and blah, blah, blah. Especially given that things like MIDI are it just works. And just will probably forever, So I guess my question is like, has there ever been a piece that you've done through the years that you've really wished you did something differently on?
Well, always,
everything,
always and never. I mean, there's two sides of it. One is, when we go through this during the design process, because we decide what features are in there and what are not, and we have to make, I was going to say arbitrary decisions, but they're anything but they're difficult decisions. And sometimes after the fact, you realize, well, that one should have been in there and that one maybe shouldn't have. But to your other point, it's a musical instrument. It is what it is. And that's the part I like. The cutoff knob is right here. It'll always be right here. It'll always do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
It never has to be updated. And it's musical instruments are not perfect.
Sure.
None are. They never have been. I mean, if you tried to come out with a guitar right now for the first time, what do you mean I have to tune it between songs? Are you kidding me? How can anybody possibly play this thing? So it's... we don't worry about that much, but I think in most cases we could think of something that we could have done differently.
I mean, I think all you have to do is really take a careful look at the instruments and see what things change each time out, and you can kind of follow the path, the track, and see, oh, okay, we actually improved this or changed this or whatever, because even. Instruments like, we came out with the Prophet 08, and then the Mofo was a little mono module version of that, and there were some changes. And then even with the keyboard, there were some more changes. And so even when we do like modules or keyboard versions of modules, whatever, they're never quite, well, except for the Prophet 6 and the OB6, I think the modules are never quite the exact same thing as the keyboards.
Yeah.
So we do make improvements along the way.
Yeah, and it seems like, I mean, the fact that you can kind of do the revision process, like the Rev 2 seemed, I don't know if this was intentional, but like maybe I should ask this as a question. Was the Rev 2 an attempt to kind of do that process of like, oh, we had the 8 come out, there was a bunch of stuff that we kind of want to see fixed on it, or was it more of just like, oh, this would be a dope idea? Like, was it driven by the mistake that you felt you made?
Speaking for myself only, the Prophet 08 was the first. I started at Dave Smith Instruments right at the beginning of 2007.
Okay.
And the Prophet 08 was the first instrument, much to my surprise, that Dave asked me to do design work on.
Yeah.
I was not actually expecting that to happen.
You were the other guy.
Hey.
Anything I didn't want to do.
Killing.
So, needless to say, your first effort at lots of things, you tend to have things in retrospect that you would do differently. And the Prophet 08 was definitely that way. I didn't think that I would ever have the opportunity to do anything about it. it just kind of worked out that way.
Yeah.
The whole thing was surprising. I mean, we stopped building them after 10 years, and people were still buying them. And I was the same way. I was still kind of relearning hardware design. I did the desktop evolver and then the other keyboard evolvers. And then this was just, an attempt to get a little bit more mainstream, but I was still learning. And there were quite a few things on there that were sort of embarrassing after the fact. Mostly considering how many people were touring with them and using them and playing them and taking them everywhere. And it's like, well, we shouldn't. The wall warts are really kind of lame. And there are a number of things we always wanted to fix. So we decided, well, it's still selling. We should really update it after 10 years. It seems like the proper thing to do. And so we were able to fix all those things, add some features, but still keep the same basic sound and reduce the price because of newer technology. And we were essentially completely blown away by how it's just taken off. We did not expect that it's just the thing out there. We just, even 2.5 years later, they're just flying out the door.
Right. It's still like kind of new. I've played on that thing so many times, thinking of it as new is strange to me, but it is kind of new still.
So it was nice to be able to fix the problems, and it was even more fun. I mean, we've already sold more Rev 2s than we sold Prophet 8s, and that's 2 years versus 10 years. Because everything's fixed. And it still sounds cool. So,
and I would imagine that you probably, I know how you guys beta test, and you're extremely detailed and everything, but there's just certain shit that you can't replicate, and I feel like touring is the big one of those. Like, you can't know, like, how is this thing going to hold up being thrown into a luggage rack like 200 times?
Well, we try to design our things to be kind of bulletproof.
Yeah.
So they tend to be pretty reliable.
How
you don't know for sure.
Yeah. Has there ever been, especially recently, given that there's so many other companies making synths, like your competition, I'm saying that in a very broad way, but is probably much bigger than it was in 1978. Like, is there anything that you have seen that has gotten you excited about wanting to make something new? Or have you ever been influenced by something that you've seen in like a different keyboard company and been like, oh shit, that would be cool to kind of modify in this way? Like, who inspires you gear wise? Because you guys are like the granddaddies, so it's like,
well, we probably have different answers to that. One of my faults is I don't really pay too much attention to everything else that's out there, and traditionally I've done that because I don't want to be swayed by what everybody else is doing, because as soon as you start trying to keep up with somebody else, then you're not really innovating because you're doing something that's already been done. Obviously, sometimes we do, things do show up, but I tend to
intentionally trying to
almost
stay
to
back.
a fault, try to avoid being swayed by what's out there and what people think. And I think it's a good way to come up with more fresh sounds and fresh ideas and designs.
Yeah.
I definitely check out the competition and see what they're doing. And there are things that I like and don't like. And, but more than anything, I think that just informs how we design instruments. And more than looking at the competition, I have a tendency to watch how people interact with instruments. The musicians themselves, our instruments and other people's. And if I see someone playing someone else's synth and they're doing something, and I think, oh, that's a really cool way to do that, I have no qualms about
that's a great idea,
borrowing those ideas from other people.
Yeah.
I mean, if it makes the instrument more effective and somehow more inspirational or easier for someone to use, then great.
I feel like, obviously, like the capacity for innovation is a huge reason for your success, but you're also seem to be incredible at being able to go between left brain and right brain. Like we were talking before, Dave and I were talking before this conversation started about how you will have one one part of a process where it's entirely creative and like, okay, I'm creating this new thing. Let's talk about like, what are the possibilities here? And then the overlap comes from the project before being super like, okay, now we have a shipping deadline. We have this thing. Like, it's almost way more concrete based. And I feel like, especially in like, I mean, I know how much trouble I have with that. Like, I can't imagine trying to write and release something at the same time. Like, I would go nuts.
Production is a bitch. It really is, because it has to be perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, everything has to work. It has to be reliable. Obviously, these days, there's not a product of any kind that doesn't have at least some software bugs.
Sure.
It could be your phone, it could be a computer, it could be your car, it could be whatever. And musical instruments are no different. And of course, we try to squash as many of those as we can, and we could update it later if things do come up. But getting the hardware perfect, where every single part is identified and where it goes, and there's no screwing around with this. You have to be perfect.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of work. And yes, it's kind of the other side of the brain.
Well, it's like, it's like any creative endeavor, whether it's making a musical instrument or making music or making a film or writing a book or whatever. You have the initial spark that carries you through a big chunk of it. But finishing is a bitch. Finishing is no fun.
Well, it says a lot about you guys. I mean, not only just the two of you, but as a company, that you can have both brains working efficiently, because I feel like that's not common. I mean, maybe I'm looking at something wrong, but like every musician I know seems to be in like, okay, now I'm going to write. Like, this is 2 weeks of writing. And then like, if there is business things happening, it's because they're famous enough or well-to-do enough to afford someone to take care of that for them. But that's fucking impressive.
Well,
It's really
in
impressive.
most companies, these things would all be handled by completely different groups.
Sure, yeah.
If you're in a huge company, there's going to be the design guys who are engineers who are executing a marketing plan that the marketing and sales people drew up in their spec. And it's not necessarily the same people doing all this. Here, we just kind of all do it as one process. But yeah, traditionally, it's completely different. The left brain and right brain are different departments that are across the street from each other.
I mean, it seems like it's working.
It is.
It's working well.
It's
And
kind
it's
of
fun.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's fun.
Yeah. I'm going to switch gears slightly. I have two questions that I feel like I get asked, I would say, like double digits throughout the week. The first one is, if you were dealing with a musician who knew nothing about synthesis, where do you start?
That's easy. No, really, all of our instruments are programmable.
Okay.
They come with usually 400 or 500 awesome sounds. So you buy the keyboard and you press a button and it makes a sound and you play it. Either you like it and it gives you musical ideas, or it doesn't, and then you try the next one.
Yeah.
And I've seen this at trade shows. People will step through the first 10 programs, and everybody stops at different programs to jam. Like, this guy stopped at program 2, this guy stopped at program 5 because it triggered something musically and they wanted to play it.
Okay.
So you don't have to know anything about any of the knobs. Just start playing.
And then if you were to recommend, like, on the academic side of like, okay, I get to this knob, this thing's killing, but I really want to know the innards of that. Like, how do you tell people to experiment? Like, what would be your recommendation?
Well, I don't know that it's quite that cut and dried. I mean, I know people, our mutual friend, Jason Lindner.
Killing.
Jason's awesome. I love what he does with his Prophet 6, and knows what to do to get to certain places and do certain things. I don't know that I hope he doesn't mind me saying this. I don't know that Jason is a
prototypical sound designer.
Yeah.
I'll say it.
Yeah.
I love you. I love you, Jason.
I do
I'm not
too.
either, so I'm fine. I come from that planet.
So, it's more about putting in the time and just trying to come to a place where you understand the instrument. It's a musical instrument.
Yeah.
You don't really need to think about it in terms of, well, okay, this is a sine wave modulating a square and, whatever in those terms. If you work with it enough, you spend enough time with it, you come to have certain expectations about what's going to happen when you do a certain thing.
A process.
Yeah.
And you don't have to know, I would suggest the first knob you turn is the cutoff knob. You don't have to know what a filter is, or what a low pass filter is. Yeah. Just turn it because something cool will probably happen.
Yeah.
And once you learn that trick, then okay, try the resonance knob next.
To those who couldn't see Dave, he was doing a knob turn movement.
But you'd be surprised that even a lot of people who are supposedly synthesizer people don't necessarily understand that much about the synths, but they're killer players and they make the instrument sound good. Yeah. But you don't have to understand it.
Yeah.
No, it's cool to see all the kids coming out of Berkeley, for example, these years, because they all have chops, but they also know all the technical stuff and they're kind of scary.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Yeah. And definitely people, the level of knowledge that people have about synthesizers is much higher now than it was in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. Jason is the perfect example of the tweak and learn variety. And I feel like I put myself in that same boat of like, if you ask me to design, like there's even things if I'm teaching a synthesis lesson where someone asks me like, what does that do? And my explanation is, I would guarantee you guys would shudder. I guarantee it. But it gets them to a certain point of knowing like, okay, this specific thing will happen. And, I found the answer I always give with those people is, you can take the academic route. You absolutely can go what is the exact definition of LFO? What is the definition of envelope?
Well, and that's how I learned synthesis because in the 70s when I was a teenager, you couldn't walk into a music store and play a synthesizer most of the time because most music stores either didn't have them or if they had one or two, they didn't want you touching them because if you got it to a point where the salesman couldn't get it back to making sound again, they were screwed. They had this, $1,300 thing sitting there on the table that didn't make any sound.
Yeah. I think maybe you mentioned this in an interview at one point. Like that's kind of the biggest plus about software synths is that like if you don't have the $2,000 or the $1,000 or whatever to really take that first step, because it's kind of a big step, like people who I have a lot of students, from various parts of the world who are like, I want to get into synthesis, but I just can't. Like something like $1,500 US is like 2 years salary for me,
Yeah.
And so you get to that point to where it's like, okay, now what's the next best bet? And I think software is the move for those people because you can usually find something that's free that at least gets you, oh, that's kind of what an LFO does. Like if I move that knob with my mouse in this annoying way.
Yeah,
like,
sure.
But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The getting your hands on it, tweaking, and just kind of, it's almost like mistaking your way into knowledge sometimes is like, that's another way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's your choice. If you want to go technical academic, you could learn it all. It's not terribly difficult. I'm sure there's tons of YouTube videos out there for basic synthesizer technology.
And in an odd way, it's almost more musical.
Sure. Yeah.
Because you're it becomes more gestural than intellectual.
Yeah.
Follow your ears.
Yeah. Well, and like, Lindner's the king of that. He's absolutely the king of that to where like, I saw him and Tim LaFave do a show where I don't think either of them actually played a note the whole show. And it was like some of the most it was some of the most beautiful shit I've ever heard. Just Lindner like doing his weird little dance, like tweaking. And it was so killing. And like, I would imagine he has his go-tos like we all do, but like it was free. Like, fuck it. Let's see what this thing does. And it was always good. Just like always good. So that's definitely a way. The other question I get asked all the time, you'll like this, is which Dave Smith sequential synth should I buy?
That's actually kind of an easy question these days. Okay. When you keep cost in mind, buy a Rev 2 8 voice. 8 voices, $1,500. It's got, it's just a very, I'll let you sing the praises, but no, I would do that over twice that for a Prophet 6 or an OB6.
Mm-hmm.
If your funds are unlimited, that's different.
Yeah,
but if you want, it's a good starter synth.
Yeah, and it's you have the upgrade capabilities. I have found what do I have of yours? I have the 8, I have the Rev 2, I have the X, and I've noticed even those 3, and I don't own a 6, but I play on them a lot. And even with those 4 boards, it's like it really depends on. It's like they're all different instruments. I mean, it's like you're going to use a Strat, and a Fender, or a Strat and a
Les Paul
on different gigs. Like it's just different shit
on the same gig.
Yeah,
different songs these days. You got to change your guitar.
People are going to laugh at my guitar knowledge there.
Well, and one thing about the Prophet 6 and the OB6 is that they are true knob per function instruments.
Mm-hmm.
You can turn the preset off and all the controls are live, and
sure,
there's no menus, no nothing. Everything is there on the panel. So that is a little bit of a different approach than our other instruments.
Sure. I know because I've seen a few of them up here, but I feel like you guys probably have you have people stopping up in the shop all the time. You always have like whoever's playing in San Francisco stops up, says hi. What have been your, and I know one that you've told me, I don't know if it'll be the one you choose, but what are your favorite like musicians coming into the shop moments? Like at least maybe of recent times.
Mine's easy.
Yeah, I know which one you're thinking. Brad?
Yep.
So that was Brad Meldau and Mark came up here. Right?
Mark Juliana brought Brad Meldau in to try out synths. Brad already had a Prophet 08.
Okay.
And we just wanted him to come in and try some stuff out. And Dave and I got to stand and not say anything in the demo room for about an hour while Brad demoed synthesizers.
He was going back and forth between the Prophet 6 and the OB6.
Yeah.
And so he'd play a little on one, and then he'd go play a little on the other. Sometimes he'd play them both at the same time. And the 3 of us, Mark was there too. We were just kind of jaws dropped, and he's just doodling, trying to decide which one to get.
Yeah,
I'm a huge fan. So
he's pretty decent at music.
Yeah.
He's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Mark tells me that story too, and it was just like the ultimate fanboy moment.
Yes, that was delightful.
Give me your what's a moment or two? Can you think of any?
There's
probably so many at this point.
Yeah, it's hard. It's easy to kind of blank out when you start trying to think of who is here, because some people come in and they all just, the whole band will come and they'll all just sit on a different keyboard and they'll start playing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it'll just be one guy. Sometimes they just come and look and don't actually play. It's always. Yeah, it's always fun and it's always enlightening. Yeah, to see what people try. A lot of times, they go, wow, a Poly Evolver. I've heard about these. I've never actually seen one, and they'll jump on that, and nothing quite sounds like that, so they get excited. And
I understand that. I mean, the first time I walked in and saw the 10,
Prophet 10,
the Prophet 10 over here, I about had to change my pants.
It can be really nice when we are, as we are now in the final stages of developing a product and trying to get something ready to ship. There are times, even though it's a good instrument and you're excited about it, there can be times at the end there where it gets a little rough. Yeah. And it's nice when somebody comes in and you show them the instrument and they're super excited about it.
Yeah.
Validates it.
Oh, okay.
Well, who did you just show? You showed the
Holy Ghost was here.
Yeah, they saw it and loved it. And you show
Matt Chamberlain and Jeff Babco.
Hey.
We're here.
Babco is one of my. I love that dude so much.
He's a great guy.
Yeah, great player too. Jesus Christ.
Yes. Well, Matt Chamberlain's pretty good too.
Matt was he was the drummer on all that Fiona Apple shit, right?
Yeah.
Killing.
Oh, he was on all that stuff.
Like everything good from that period of time on, really.
Yes, kind of.
So I wanted to ask you, like, you guys are so involved in the process of like kind of the business of music, even though it's like a fun thing. what are you hearing from music nowadays that is there anything that's exciting you that's coming out, sonically that you're latching onto? Is there any trends that you're nervous about?
Nervous.
I mean, just musically, not even business-wise.
Well,
that's kind of a broad question.
It's kind of like a couple different directions there.
Yeah. I only ask it because I know that all three of the people in this room are very opinionated. So
yeah.
Well, I mean, there's having been through the 70s and the 80s and seen what happened to Sequential, which, company that has little or no relation to this Sequential in terms of how it does business and how business is going.
Sure.
It's always in the back of your mind that, what happens if the bottom just falls out of this one of these days? What happens if synthesizers are just not cool anymore?
Everyone gets hip to just guitars again.
Yeah.
It happens every 20 years. It's about due.
Yeah.
But I think that subtractive analog synthesis is past the test of time now. I think the first time around, 70s and 80s, people were playing it because it was the most emulative. This is pre-samplers. And what people really wanted back then was pianos and organs and brass and strings. And once the M1 came out, then everybody was happy. And then synths went away. But this time around, people are playing synths because they want to play synths. And everybody knows how an analog synth works. You know where the cutoff knob is. You know what it's going to sound like when you turn it, no matter what instrument from what manufacturer. I think it's going to be around for a long time. Now, it may easily become less fashionable.
Sure.
But I'm not afraid of any new technologies because nothing else quite works as easily and logically as analog synths. There's all the things, there's granular synthesis and physical modeling and FM and all these things, and they all sound great for what they do. But nothing has the ease of use and the wide palette that you get out of an analog synth.
Yeah, and it's one of the things, talking about opinions, it's one of the things that kind of bugs me. And we'll get emails sometimes that are like just downright rude from people.
Oh, no.
Like, why don't you guys do such and such?
Why haven't you made an
doing
organ
the same
yet?
things over and over again? No, they're looking for they want us to do whatever the next new breakthrough in synthesis is and whatever. And all I'm really concerned about is making a quality musical instrument that is going to hopefully inspire people to make music. And I don't think we're making the same old thing. Yeah, they're subtractive synthesizers. Yes, it's a technology that's been around for, however 50 whatever years. But
there's a reason for that.
Yeah, and I feel like we're still getting it better.
Yeah.
We're still working on it and improving how these things work and how people relate to them.
Yeah. Let me give my little nerdy synth kids, let me give them a round robin, extremely quick synth tip question, and then I'll get out of you guys' hair. The top questions I get asked are, how do you make an interesting pad? Where do you start coughly?
Pad, turn the cutoff down a little bit or put a little bit of a swell on it. Couple different wave shapes with a little bit of shape modulation or pulse width modulation.
Yeah, that's the thing for me is any kind of motion you add to it. So Rev 2 is particularly good for that because it has shape mod on all the waveforms.
Yep.
So you can get that kind of almost detune sound
without actually detuning.
Yeah. But you want to detune also.
Yeah.
Sure.
Great bass patch.
Monophonic.
Low
register.
I'm just curious to see how you guys answer.
A little bit of resonance and then envelope, depending on what kind of a pluck you want or,
I don't want to give anything away, but I've been spending an awful lot of time lately with 2-pole low pass and a sawtooth and just one oscillator.
Oh, wow. Damn. Okay.
That's one, I think one oscillator patches. I've been having this talk with another of our coworkers.
Yeah.
One oscillator synth patches, I think, kind of get short shrift because there's no beating. It cuts through like crazy.
Yeah. That's a problem with bass sounds if you have more than one oscillator,
Mm-hmm.
because if they phase at all, unless you have a wave reset function.
The bass vibe for me is the single voice square wave. Like, just like all I ever want is like just square wave, slight envelope on the top of it just to cut it off, and like that's it. What if this is another hilarious question? Not hilarious because I get it, but the question of like, how do I make my synth sound warmer?
Warmer. Turn the cutoff down a little bit again. When the cutoff's wide open, you got all the harmonics and it's going to be bright. And try wave shapes that are not quite saws, back off on that a little bit, I guess. And buy a good synthesizer that just sounds that way.
Yeah.
That is a lot of it. I mean, some synths just have a more aggressive filter. Digital synths are often, that way because of the way they sound. To a certain degree, just having, the Prophet X is a good example. You can have a digital front end, but if you run the sound through analog filters, that's instant warmth. Yeah, it really is. I mean,
I definitely, I'm going to put a company on blast, but I've done that multiple times in these podcasts, so they'll hate me more. But I had a Nord lead at one point, and like the possibilities of things you could do with the board were like really killing, and had all these routing options that were interesting and everything. But like, having it sit next to the Prophet 8, it's like same waveform. Like you just hear the one, you're like, oh, that's cool. And then you hear the other one, you're like, oh.
Instant warm.
It's just, sometimes it's just the board.
It's because we'll even get questions from people saying, hey, how come your stuff doesn't sound as warm as the vintage stuff? And all of our stuff, without exception, I think, passes more high end than virtually any vintage synthesizer. As Dave said, if you want it to sound more like a vintage synthesizer, close the cutoff down a little
just
bit.
A little bit.
Take some of the high end out.
Yeah.
There are other things. There are tuning irregularities and things like that also account for some of that. But the knock that something sounds too bright, or the one that always gets me is it sounds digital. Well, no, it doesn't actually sound digital at all. It's just brighter than I can go from playing one of our things to playing my Rev 2 Prophet 5, and it sounds like what happened? Is the EQ like turned down or something? And there's like no high end left.
Well, I feel like people kind of end up with their buzzwords of like, this means this, and they just use it as like
right.
We use all, whatever.
Our stuff, the noise floor is way lower than the vintage instruments, and typically passes more high end. A lot of the vintage stuff stops at about 12K or something.
Yeah.
But that's why we usually include a slop knob so that you can dial in.
Hell yes.
Some people equate sloppiness with warmth. Because that was the vintage sound.
Yeah.
And so you can dial that in.
It's kind of wrong, and you want that.
Yeah, the good kind of wrong.
Well, I am, and again, we can't mention it, but I am hyped for the future. I think everything you're doing is fucking magic. It really is.
Thanks.
I love using it. I love like watching the joy of, you guys showing it off, and it's like, again, it's really motivational to see people like doing something for a while, sticking with one process, being successful, and doing it for the right reasons. It seems, like you're doing that.
Well, and it works both ways, as I said before. Yeah. It's like it's people like you that make it fun for us to make these instruments. So.
Instruments are useless unless musicians play them.
Well, keep making them, and we'll keep playing them. And I actually made a note that I have to mention that if you guys ever make a record, I would love to be a part of the production process. I really want to hear like a Sequential record or a Dave Smith record. Just kind of want to hear it for selfish reasons. So please, at some point.
Wow.
I'd just be really, really hyped about that. But thank you for everything. Thank you for meeting with me. And
thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed listening to that episode as much as I enjoyed doing it. And be sure to head over to my Instagram at Nicholas T. Semrad to check out the latest clip I've put up from our sponsors over at Spectrasonics. I decided to do a little soundscape where I interact with the hardware profile that they've created for the Prophet 08. It automatically maps to the board. So unlike a normal MIDI controller in which I'd have to put everything in its right place, they did all the work for me. If I move the board's cutoff knob, the cutoff knob on the software moves as well. Same thing for the noise function, LFOs, envelopes, you name it, it does it. It's absolutely crazy. So go check it out, and I'll see y'all next time here at the Grid Kids Podcast.